Okay, today we're going to talk about the different penetration test engagement types. This is a great webinar for people who, maybe in a buying position but don't have a lot of experience with penetration tests or don't understand the different types or what may be the best fit for their organization. Today we have, for quick intros, myself, Christian Hyde. I'm a managing director and co-founder at Risk360. I help lead our security practice, but we also have our celebrity guest here, Ryan Baisden, who's the leader of our penetration tests practice. Ryan, do you mind doing a quick intro?
Sure. My name's Ryan. I, as Christian said, lead the pen test practice. I have about 7 years of experience in security. Some of that was on the corporate side. More recently, in the last 2.5 years, that has been on the consulting side, which is to say the offensive, paid to be a hacker side.
Yep. So Ryan, we're going to kind of talk about what we're talking about here. So you wrote a white paper, I guess, going on a year ago now that's been pretty popular, and I thought it'd be great to turn that into a webinar where you go through and you describe the different types of penetration tests and the level of effort versus risk management that you get out of each. So what we want to do is talk through each of those. So you kind of have, starting at the lightest, the attack surface reconnaissance, down to vulnerability scans, internal, external pen testing, all the way to red team. So we'll talk through each of those. But first, let's talk a little bit about why this matters. So in your mind, Ryan, why does it matter to the executive potentially buying a pen test to be educated about, what they might be purchasing, the level of risk management?
Sure. So right now, there's a lot of market saturation around pen testing by people who claim to be doing pen testing in X amount of time for X amount of dollars. There are a lot of problems with that, in that pen testing is not a simple thing to do. It's highly complex. It requires an immense amount of prerequisite knowledge and an understanding of an environment and a special mindset
It does. Like, I know one thing that we see kind of in the marketplace is you take, like, say a bank is requiring one of our customers to get a pen test. And I think one of the things that we run into on the security side when we're building security programs is there's no clear definition of what that means. So on the light end, it might be a vulnerability scan, and on the heavy end, it might be a really good penetration test, but the level of risk management is totally different. So you have these executives that maybe are tricked. I won't say tricked, but maybe they think they have a false sense of security that they're buying a really great product, but it's really a vulnerability scan, something that's automated, only looking at external IPs, but didn't even look at the application at all. And I know that's been a source of frustration for us when we're trying to do audits or accept evidence or do due diligence on customers, and they think they've done the right thing, but in fact, they really haven't. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, as a penetration tester, like, where's that coming from, or like, what do you think the right place to start is when you're an executive trying to get a pen test?
Sure. So it starts with a misconception. I think there are people or companies who think they know what a pen test is and are willing to sell that and claim that they can sell that, and they don't know, and they're selling to people who shouldn't know, but the people who shouldn't know are the ones who are suffering because of it. So, for example, there are services out there that claim to do your pen test in 5 minutes, and maybe they'll charge you $500. In reality, they're just running a port scan, and any good pen tester knows that a port scan isn't going to give you anything useful at all.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a big problem in the marketplace. The other thing that we run into is, so Risk360 being an audit firm on the side of our business, is we go to do these audits, let's say a PCI audit, and we have a client that says, yeah, we had a pen test because that's one of the compliance requirements. And you get the report back and it's not a penetration test at all. It was a vulnerability scan, or maybe it was a pen test, but it didn't cover the right subject matter. So they didn't get the right amount of advisory. So I think all of those things, making sure that you're getting what you think you're paying for, that you're actually solving for the risk. So you might have a business application that you need to focus on, but got a network penetration test. That doesn't make sense. and that you're meeting your compliance requirements, and that if you have business partners or third parties that want to see what type of pen test or want to see that level of risk management, you're actually getting them what they need. So for all those reasons, I hope that during this webinar we can kind of cover off on what is the best fit for each individual company's use case. So let's kick it off here. So the first one is kind of the attack surface recon. And the way I understand this, Ryan, is an attack surface recon is pretty much always part of a larger penetration test, but you might do this as a standalone engagement. So can you maybe tell us what this is in your mind and kind of how you would go about doing some of this work?
Yeah, that hits the nail on the head. So a lot of these engagements we're going to talk about really just emulate part of what an advanced persistent threat would do in entirety. So there are things that define each of these engagements primarily by what is being left out. And we can get into that a little bit later, talking about leaving, for example, phishing out of penetration tests. But as far as attack surface recon, the things that are left out are some of the biggest ones: exploitation, actually enumerating attack vectors. Really what's happening in an attack surface recon is if I have a target, I'm looking to understand what makes up that target: subdomains, servers, external networks, even some that the target client environment, those who make up that client environment, might not know about. There might be assets that they have lost track of that are gone under the radar that could very well be vulnerable. And even if that's not scoped into a pen test, because those requesting the pen test aren't aware of it, then it will never get tested. But someone who really knows what they're doing might find it, and that will become a problem in a real world situation.
Yeah, so you could think that you have 10 servers, but you really have 100 servers and you have no idea, right? So
exactly.
That's sometimes an issue. Does this also include like the open source intelligence gathering from people? Yeah, so that's an area that fascinates me. And if you're not familiar with what that is on the webinar, so sometimes if you're doing like any kind of social engineering or something that might involve people, there's ways to go through, I guess, call it information available to you on the internet and find out about individuals so you can guess their password, or that you can try to use them in social engineering tactics. So can you kind of talk through like some of that open source intelligence gathering and like some of the sources that you might look at and some of the information that you've been able to gather in the past? Because I think that's really interesting.
Sure. Open source intelligence relies heavily on correlated data. So finding information about people from several different sources and then putting it all together to mean something. For example, finding out an email address pattern used by a company. Is it first name dot last name? Is it first name last name? Is it first initial and then last name? That stuff matters, because that's the information that somebody's going to take into, for example, a password breach database, and they're going to search based on that pattern. They're going to find people who have potentially used a work email address for something not related to work that was involved in a password breach. And therefore, if they're using the same password everywhere, it's more than likely that their breached LinkedIn password, for example, is also their corporate email password.
Yep.
I mentioned social media just now. There is a huge amount of useful information that most people put on social media, and LinkedIn's not excluded. Just because it's meant to have a business context does not mean that there's not a lot of useful information on there. For example, college graduation dates. That gives me a really good idea of when somebody's birthday is. How many security questions and how many password reset mechanisms have you run into that involve putting in your birthday?
Yep. Yeah, I know there's been a dozen times at this point probably where you will bring back to me someone's email and password from just password dumps that are available on the internet. And before we started working together, I didn't realize just how pervasive that was, that there's huge databases, quote unquote, on the dark web where you can, grab those, mine those. And I mean, there's probably thousands or maybe even millions of, breached passwords and usernames available out there. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think a lot of folks aren't aware that exists.
Sure. So when a company gets a database breach, it happened to LinkedIn, I think in 2014 or 2015.
Yeah.
Someone found a way to leak info on, I'm not sure if it was all of the users. I have to go back and look, but it was millions and millions of users, and that included emails and password hashes. And in this case, the hashes are not plain text passwords, which is good, but because the hashing algorithm used was not strong, the hashes could be cracked relatively quickly, and then the plain text passwords were exposed. This happens on an unfortunately regular basis with services and companies who are not securing their data well enough, and once it gets breached, it is not obfuscated well enough to not be usable. So there have been I can't even begin to count them. An enormous number of breaches. There's so many that services like SpyCloud and Have I Been Pwned make a lot of good money, allowing people to see what passwords they have that have been involved in breaches, and letting them know so they can go and fix them.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know there's both like ethical for-profit companies that gather these sources and make them available for ethical purposes. And then there's also nefarious actors out there who do the same thing and monetize that. So that's extremely, it's kind of this interesting economy that's developed just based on that type of data.
Yeah, there's a whole new attack type that's been coined in the last couple of years called credential stuffing. It used to be that you would just spray random passwords at a login form or something that you're trying to break into. But now, if you know the company that owns the login form for X application, you can actually just go search password breach data and get a whole list of probably very good passwords that will get you in much more quickly.
Cool. So attack surface recon, just broad summary, you're gathering intelligence on an organization, you're validating the scope of their assets. Is it 10 servers, is it 100 servers, and really trying to educate the end user on what their universe is so that hopefully they can come back and protect those assets from a security perspective. I know you said typical efforts low, level of risk management is low because it's more information gathering. How long would something like this take on a 500-person company, like a kind of an average size company?
On a 500-person company doing this really well, I would expect to take 4 to 5 days.
Yep.
Obviously, you could spend any amount of time on this, but as far as the things that don't require deep research, that can be gathered much more quickly than some of the deeper analysis results.
Sure. Great. So kind of next on the docket, you go from attack surface analysis, you have a pretty good list of what your assets look like, and then you do vulnerability scanning. And vulnerability scanning, and one of my from my perspective, is one of the best things you can do. I think it's like a pretty low effort thing that you can do that gives you a pretty good bit of risk management, especially if you have a vulnerability management program, which is probably a separate topic here. But can you talk about like just what you're seeing? What is a vulnerability scan? Well, let's just start there for folks who don't know.
Yeah, so understanding vulnerability scanning first requires understanding what a CVE is. So a CVE is an official identification of a technical vulnerability. Eternal Blue is a great example. The SMB vulnerability in Windows that came out, I think 2017 now, that was almost immediately weaponized and used for ransomware attacks across the globe. That would count as a CVE. The reason vulnerability scanning is useful in this context is because you may very well have heard of Eternal Blue. You may not know that there are domain controllers and endpoints you have that are vulnerable to Eternal Blue. And that's highly problematic because exploiting Eternal Blue is frankly as simple as a few keystrokes now that it's been loaded into exploitation frameworks like Metasploit. So I don't want to say almost, a high number of the compromises we're able to carry out during a pen test are due to CVEs that would have been picked up during vulnerability scanning. Pen testing can go much farther beyond just vulnerability scanning and exploiting the findings, but this is the low-hanging fruit of pen testing. This is what will be an easy compromise for someone looking to do damage.
Yeah, I always think of it kind of like a cat and mouse game, because I think there's maybe a perception sometimes that if you get a pen test or if you patch your system, you're kind of secure on a go-forward basis. But every system is vulnerable or becomes vulnerable because you have folks researching, how to break into a system. So as the marketplace realizes that there's a new way to break into a system or there's some newly discovered vulnerability to that system, they release that to the wild, and there's companies that make money off this and take that into a CVE and then build it into their scanning devices so they can identify that, and hopefully your organization can patch that. So I think sometimes when you purchase a pen test, we've seen in the marketplace, what really happens is they get a vulnerability scan, which is not great because that's an automated process that can take a couple days, and you're not actually executing any of the vulnerabilities, I guess. So if you find something, you're not doing something about it. But this really comes back to me for trying to get a vulnerability management program where you're in a cadence of doing, weekly or monthly scans and then correcting whatever issues you have. That's where vulnerability scanning, in my mind, really adds a lot of value. Okay, cool. So vulnerability scanning in my mind is pretty simple. Can you talk about like how do you go about scoping? What's the amount of effort for vulnerability scanning?
Sure. Vulnerability scanning, thankfully, is extremely low effort. The largest commitments involved are generally the purchasing of a high quality vulnerability scanning tool. For example, Nessus, Qualys, Acunetics are all for different things. Nessus will do, in my experience, a great job as far as network vulnerability scanning. Yep. Some are more geared towards general purpose. Others are much better at identifying web vulnerabilities. But again, these are purchases and setups and runs, and then looking at the results. What really makes them useful after the fact is taking the results and putting them into actionable categories. What can be done about them? How soon can something be done about them? Because you could have the best tool in the world giving you the best results, but if nothing is done about those findings, then it doesn't matter.
Yep, I kind of like vulnerability scanning too, because there's a little bit of upfront effort for an organization. So, a few days of setting it up, identifying the ranges that you want scanned, getting on your system. But if you do it right and you set it up, then you can automate it thereafter pretty much. So your effort goes from, a little bit up front, but then almost no effort to perform the actual scan on a go forward basis. So in my mind, a lot of value there. So then we go into I guess the first stage of a real, quote unquote, real penetration test. And then there's some terminology, because even at the network pen test level, you have an internal pen test and an external pen test. And sometimes I think hearing those words for the first time is a bit confusing. So if we're talking about, can you define those terms for us, Ryan? Like, what is a network pen test, and what's the difference between an internal and an external pen test?
Sure. So without getting too caught up in terminology, we like to break pen tests into the external and internal category. Obviously, every pen test is different. It's not easy to fit every single engagement into one of two buckets, but we do this to make sense of things for our services. So external pen tests are exactly what they sound like. What we want to test in that kind of engagement is, how could somebody get in from the outside? Assuming they don't have, for example, a Wi-Fi password. Maybe they don't have a VPN login. They don't have a web application login. What can they see from the internet and identify from the internet that might be useful to them if they just wanted to identify somebody's web presence and take advantage of that and potentially break into something important? The internal pen test, this is our most common type of network pen test. We operate these from what we call an assumed breach perspective. So we assume that a Wi-Fi password could be broken. We assume that an employee could be phished and access to their endpoint, even if it's just user level access, could be gained by somebody really trying to get in. We start from that point. We pretend that we are already at that point, either by sitting on the Wi-Fi, by having a user account on a network, and doing our best to understand what can happen from there. The network, the perimeter, the wall, so to speak, has already been breached. Now what?
Yep. And I know for me, from an outsider's perspective, not understanding the technical details to the level you do, I think there's a lot of value in blending these when I'm thinking about it, because most executives, they're concerned, can you get in from the outside? Can a person off the street get in? So that's kind of the external. There's some value to be had there. And then the other question always is what if someone does get in? Can they move laterally within the network? Can they be a standard user, but go get my most prized possessions and my customer data? And that's where the internal side really comes in handy. And I'm always surprised at what you guys are able to do internally. And I don't know what the stat is exactly. It's got to be above 90%, but you know, I think you guys always are able to escalate your privileges to administrator rights, which at that point means you can get to any data that you want, and that's a little bit frightening, but also very valuable to the organizations that we do these tests for, because they're able to, you know, track their steps and hopefully close some of those gaps and at least get some education out of it and realize, hey, I'm not bulletproof here. There's stuff I need to be doing.
Sure, it is a little bit frightening, but what I always say is that if someone's going to do it, we're the best ones to do it.
Yeah, it's definitely better that we do it than you know, somebody actually wants to steal the data. Can you talk a little bit about efforts? And I know this is like highly variable and based on organizational size, and you could never stop and keep going forever. But kind of what does a typical engagement life cycle look like for this?
We like to spend at least a full week on the actual exercises portion of network pen testing, which means for us a week of mapping the environment, understanding what's going on, scanning for vulnerabilities, looking for misconfigurations, weaknesses, and then actually taking advantage of them. So 40 to 50 hours, if possible, in a classic environment. Much bigger environments would also need a bigger commitment, more than likely, to make sure we cover everything, we understand as much as possible, and we pass off the most useful results we can. But generally, a week is enough.
Yeah, I think just based on the clients that I know about, I know that kind of some environments are a week of actual pen test execution, but then we do have some that they're up in the 4 and 5 week range, just because they're more complex, larger environments. Great. So let's move on to kind of the next stage. So if you've been doing penetration tests, you're kind of at the place where you're ready to mature. You can perhaps get in the continuous penetration test, and that's kind of I guess we have our own thoughts about what that means and how to do that, breaking things up into missions and doing multiple penetration tests throughout the year. But Ryan, can you maybe describe in your mind, like, what is a continuous pen test and why that's valuable? Sure.
So as we've touched on a little bit already, there are some smaller environments out there and there are some really big environments. A lot of environments today are utilizing a whole lot of different stacks of technology. So AWS and other cloud providers like Azure are a huge factor, especially if there's a mix of technologies in there. Sometimes regular old hosts, classical networks, are being hosted in cloud environments. And it's at the same time that Amazon's web services features are being used. So EC2 instances are potentially in the mix there. There might be web applications that are being hosted from AWS environments. So the environment is multifaceted. And because of that, the attack surface is huge. So where continuous pen testing becomes highly beneficial is setting up different smaller engagements to target specific parts of the environment so that it doesn't all just get pushed into 1 week and a lot gets missed.
Yeah. The other thing that I've seen that I think makes a lot of sense for organizations is if you have, like, for example, a major change. So a lot can change over a year. So, you know, you could pen test an environment at the beginning of the year and that environment looked completely different towards the end of the year. So your risk profile's changed. But if you're breaking things up into, let's say, quarterly pen tests, well, you'll capture those changes along the way and have a really high level of assurance. The other thing that I think is valuable is in the DevOps lifecycle. Let's say that you have, you know, quarterly releases, just use something simple, and every quarter you're releasing a new module or a new application or a major new feature set on your web app. Well, it's great to get a pen test cadence in that within that as well. That way, every time a major feature is released, you have experts like yourself doing some penetration test activities and, you know, solving any bugs and building that into the DevOps lifecycle. So again, every company is different. They're going to have different life cycles. They're going to have different decision points and priorities throughout the year. But if you're on a continuous pen test cycle, that helps you embed security in the process as you go. And I think there's a lot of value to be had there. I know how we tend to break these up is, you know, I think our most common is doing kind of a quarterly pen test cycle or for a year, something like that. I have a lot of companies that want to do that, and each one has a separate scope, separate mission and objective. So we kind of call them mission-based, where one might be a network level, one might be an app level, one might be for a major change or whatever happens during the year. who do you think, like, at what stage should a company start thinking about moving from an annual pen test into like more than one pen test a year? When have you seen that transition, right?
I think when growth is really high, when
Yeah.
suddenly not only is there a lot of autonomy in the environment about what can be spun up and what can be created as far as assets, network resources, but when deployments are happening much faster. For example, if a new client acquisition forces you to perhaps migrate your API from SOAP to REST, maybe now you've abandoned XML and you're using JSON now to do everything with your API. That's great. You've excluded some attack vectors that existed before, but you've also introduced new possibilities as far as what can be attacked. So I love that you mentioned DevOps, because continuous deployments, if security is not built into the tool chain, then it can be overlooked. And so being able to continuously assess those deployments on rapid deployment products, high-speed DevOps processes is very useful. I think that once the environment starts to become very, very big, dependent on that attack surface analysis type engagement that we mentioned earlier, then continuous pen testing, either to sync up with DevOps processes and infrastructure builds, or to just make sure that every part of an environment is being covered. I think that speed and size largely determine this.
Yep, I agree. So great. So let's move on to, I think, what is your favorite topic, Ryan, is getting into like a red team engagement. And in my mind, this is kind of like this is the cream of the crop for organizations. You know, they've really moved beyond the annual pen tests. They're probably even beyond the just continuous pen tests. They have a risk profile that merits almost an ongoing kind of, you know, real life attack scenario. So can you, I know that this is called a lot of different things, I guess, red teaming, but can you talk about what red teaming is and why an organization might want to consider that?
Yeah, you just said it. I'll reiterate it. I don't want to get too caught up in terminology, but red team asterisk, so to speak, is the idea of emulating or simulating as best as possible an advanced persistent threat. So doing what we can to act like one of these attackers that shows up in the news, right? The APTs, from the APT list, nation states, involving every attack vector possible. In other words, no holds barred, unless explicitly stated. Obviously, we would never want to do anything that somebody didn't want us to do. But this is where we would try our best to do what a real attacker would do. So can an employee be phished? Does that allow us into the network? Are there physical security issues that would allow us to get into a server room? Can we break into the wireless network? Any and all methods are considered fair game here, unless explicitly stated not to be. And this is an engagement that I consider to be very useful for high maturity companies who have maybe a dedicated security staff. Maybe they have security programs and policies that they've been following for a while that they know are robust because they've tested them. And they want to know what the gaps are that can't be covered by a product purchase, can't be covered by cadences that might have been overlooked by human error, the little stuff that can go a long way in the hands of somebody who knows what they're doing and wants to do damage with that.
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, an organization has to have a high risk profile because this is a lot of effort. It's a lot of effort in terms of cost. It's a lot of effort in terms of we're going to find a lot of stuff and they need to act on that. So it takes a certain amount of commitment. But there are organizations, a lot of organizations that are large, that they have, you know, a risk profile that they need to be doing this to have a defensible approach. You know, there's certain types of data. Maybe they're you know, maybe they're a public company, very visible. They get a lot of activity, so they can't really risk. You know, one, they need to reduce their risk of actually an external attacker being successful. So they have to get ahead of that. And two, if someone is successful, they have to have a defensible approach in the court of law to point back to something saying, hey, look, we're doing our best. We were victims here. And a really solid red team engagement is something great to point back to, because how can you fault a company that has a whole team of professionals doing penetration test engagements on them all the time, and they're still attacked? I mean, there's not much more you can do than that. So I think that puts companies in a very defensible position if they do have something happen, and hopefully in a preventative position where they don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, the hope is that this kind of exercise tests response more than anything.
Yep.
You want to get the best idea of what you can detect and how quickly you can react. It's not just about finding the coolest way in. It's not just about finding the biggest weakness. What we would hope that a company or client got out of a red team engagement is understanding how well their current controls work and how much that mitigates the risk that they face.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's interesting when you do a red team engagement and they never knew you were there. That's kind of the worst case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Like there should be enough tripwires in place where they at least shut you down, or at least said, hey, we see you, proceed, but we see you. But
right.
To me, it's always a little bit scary when we're doing pen test engagements and we never even hear from a client. They never knew we were there. They never saw anything funny.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always a red flag for me. And then other situations where they're like, hey, just making sure this is you, we see you. And it's like, well, good. You can see that your defenses are up. So that's always a good sign. Cool. So I guess those are the main types of penetration test engagements. And we've talked through those. I do want to make available to people, we do have a resource. So if you would prefer to have this information in written format, so you can go share it with the team or read through that, you can download the penetration test engagement types white paper that Ryan wrote. So thank you for doing that, Ryan. There's some links here. You can go to risk360.com/whitepapers and download that. Also, I want to plug the project that you're working on. We talked a little bit about password cracking up in the kind of the Recon section.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us like a 2-minute spill over Project Aries and what you're working on there?
Yeah, sure. So a while back, we were looking for a decent way to do password cracking that did not involve buying 15 GPUs and putting them all in a rack, because that's extremely expensive and requires a lot of power consumption. So when I was looking for a good solution, I found a couple people who were saying, hey, there are these AWS instances that you can just rent for a minute that are extremely high power. They've got giant NVIDIA Tesla GPUs behind them, and I use this for password cracking, and you only have to pay for the time you use. And I remember thinking, wow, that sounds way too good to be true. Turns out it absolutely is true, and this is not a plug for AWS at all. It's just what we have used to date. So what I started doing was I started spinning up EC2 instances with GPUs attached to them and cracking passwords, and it was costing me less than $25 to do every time I did it. And that was way cheaper than buying $15,000 to $20,000 worth of GPUs and having them in one location unaccessible. So that was working really well. What we wanted to do more than that, my friend and I, my friend Stefan, who is an AWS consultant, he and I thought, well, what if we could just do this without ever having to touch the AWS console? What if we could just send a hash of a password we wanted to crack to an instance through the command line, and AWS would do the rest? It would spin the instance up, it would start the cracking process. If it got a password, it would shut the EC2 instance down and then send us the plain text password, all for as little cost as possible. And so that's what we built, and we were able to do that. We were able to build basically an infrastructure as a service setup with AWS and some custom Python that allowed us to just send a password hash from a command line argument with some AWS keys, wait a minute, and then our plain text password would come back, and it would cost us cents on the dollar compared to what it was costing us before. So extremely low cost, extremely high efficiency password cracking with just about no responsibility for the infrastructure.
That's awesome. And from what I understand, you've made that, or you're making that open source. So blue teams or pen test teams inside organizations or other ethical pen test teams can access that if they want to. Is that right?
Correct. It is not public yet, but we are completely planning on it being open source. We're not looking to sell it or trademark it or
Awesome.
anything. We want this to be accessible to people.
Cool. That's a cool project, Ryan. So if you guys want to contact Ryan, you can see his email up here, his first last name at risk360.com, myself. Also, you can download the white papers and get any information you need. So thanks for watching, and hope you got a lot out of this.